I have a Minolta MC Rokkor-PF 55mm f1.7 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. This is the MC2 style of this lens. There was also an MC1 version of the lens. And what that means is, and how you can tell that this is the MC2 style of the lens, is looking here at the filter ring. You'll notice it's got the metal body design of the earlier MC Minolta lenses here. But if you actually look at the focusing ring, going around on the top, if you look at it from the top, the focusing ring has these kind of indentations or wave-like pattern going around. Whereas with the MC1 style lenses, this is a 35mm lens, but it shows the general MC1 design. If you look at it from the top, it's just perfectly circular going around, so there's no indentations on the focusing ring. I think there's also a MC1 style version of this 55mm f1.7 lens. I think that internally they're very similar lenses, but I just wanted to take this one apart. In case you have this version, then it will be able to better match up, and it should exactly match what you're seeing in this video. So what I'm going to be doing is taking this lens fully apart, showing how you would access the diaphragm, access the optics. I'm also going to take apart the diaphragm and then explain how all the mechanical sections of this lens work. So for the disassembly, the main things that I'm going to be using today to actually take the lens apart: a spanning wrench here, so a flat tip spanning wrench is necessary for a few places, a JSX screwdriver, a small one, so you can also get away with using a small Phillips head screwdriver, but this just is generally easier to work with, and then for a small slotted screwdriver for actually taking apart the diaphragm, and a pair of tweezers here for also taking apart the diaphragm, because you don't want to be touching those blades directly. So if you're not taking apart the diaphragm, all you really need are these two pieces. And you can get away without even using the spanning wrench in some cases, but the spanning wrench makes things a lot easier. So to start off with, let's get access to the back of the diaphragm. So I'm going to go in from the back of the lens here and just expose the back of the diaphragm. So this lens is very simple in its layout, and on the back here we've got the back optics. There's two sets of little divots on either side of this back optics on these black rings. There's one on the inside right here, and then there's one on the outside here and here. You want the exterior divots with the spanning wrench, because that will undo the entire back optical assembly and just allow us to actually remove the entire back optical element. All right, so there's all the back optics of the lens, and now we've gone and exposed the back of the aperture there. So got the back of the aperture exposed. Now we'll actually go in from the front of the lens and expose the front of the aperture as well. You can see that mine has a little bit of a dent on the filter ring over here on this side. That makes removing the name ring going around here a little bit more difficult, but you can still remove it. So to remove the name ring, to start off on this front disassembly, there are two divots on the front of the name ring, one over here and one over here. So you also just go in with the spanning wrench and remove the name ring. So that exposes the interior of the lens a little bit, and you can see that there's another set of divots on these black rings going around the optics on the front of the lens. So you again want the exterior divots here. The interior divots actually remove one of the rings that holds in the various optical elements in the lens, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But I'm going to go on the exterior divots with the spanning wrench and just remove all the optics together. All right, so there are all the front optics of the lens. So looking at the optics here, here's the front optics. If you look a little bit closer at these, so the interior divots here, what those actually allow you to do, if you undo these, there are 4 of them going around here. Those allow you to undo the front element here and actually go into the optics here and start taking those apart. I generally only recommend doing that if the front optics have major damage in some way, if there's fungus inside of the optics themselves, or some major problem, because you're more likely to introduce new dust and fingerprints into the lens. So if there's just like a tiny speck of dust, you should probably not take apart the optics, but you can take them apart, and especially on these larger normal length Minolta lenses, and especially on the old MC style ones, you can really take apart all the optics pretty well. So you'd go in, I'm not going to show this, but you'd go in from the front here, remove this front optics just by undoing the various rings and start going through the lens that way. And you can also unscrew on the back here to start going in that way. Very similar setup with the back optics. So you would just go in and remove the little rings going around here and start going into the lens that way. Or on the other side, there's 2 little divots as well. Start going into the lens that way based on, and you'd want to select whatever, start with whatever side you think the fungus or whatever damage to the lens is closer to. So here with the lens body, now we've exposed both sides of the diaphragm. And on this particular lens, actually taking apart the entire, or removing the entire diaphragm assembly from the lens is so easy that there's no real advantage to just keeping the lens in this state and trying to clean the diaphragm here. It's really better to just remove the entire diaphragm for most cases, which is what we're going to do now. So I'll keep going in from the front here. So looking at the front, next up we have this lens, it's the filter ring holder going around here. It's this black section on the top of the lens. Well, it's held in place by these 3 screws, so we'll undo these 3. So there's that ring, and now we have the focusing mechanism down here on the outside, exposed the top of that, and then the diaphragm assembly, the diaphragm housing right down here, all exposed. So the diaphragm housing is held in place by 4 screws going around here. We'll remove those 4. So the entire diaphragm just lifts out right like that. So there's the entire diaphragm housing. That's one of the nice features about these earlier MC style lenses, is that usually the diaphragm on these normal length lenses at least is completely removable. So we have the entire housing here and some of the mechanical couplings on the back separate from the rest of the lens body. So I'm just going to set the diaphragm aside. We'll return to actually disassemble it and take out the individual blades, which is something you need to do if there's oil on the blades and you need to clean them off. But now let's take a look at the rest of the lens here. And we'll start going in from the back of the lens to get access to a few more elements. It's a very simple layout for the rest of the lens here. So to actually remove this back mounting plate from the rest of the lens, it's held in place by the 4 screws going around on the interior black section here. So I'll undo those 4. So as you can see, the mounting plate here has some of the mechanical sections for the back of the lens as well. It's a very nice self-contained piece here, and this exposes all the mechanical workings of the lens, which we'll talk more about on the reassembly and how everything is getting coupled together. But it's pretty simple. It's very similar to a lot of Minolta lenses. On the back section of this piece, there are 2 other things that you can remove, but I'll just explain how those are done because you really don't usually need to do this. So this black intersection here, which is just a protective ring going around, and it keeps dust and other things from going into the lens here. You can remove that by undoing these 3 black screws, and then that will just lift out of place. If you're actually trying to take apart and repair some of the mechanical sections here, that's something you'd probably need to do, but in most cases that's not necessary. And then there's this silver ring going around the back here. That is held in place by these 3 screws. Again, that's I'm pretty sure the silver ring is mainly cosmetic from as far as I know, but it's really not something that you need to take apart most of the time because it's not going to affect the operation of the lens in almost all cases. So I'm just going to set that piece aside as is. Now we'll take a look at the rest of the lens here. A few more pieces we can remove. So first off, I have the aperture control ring going around here. The reason you might want to remove this is to actually clean it because it's got all these little grooves that tend to accumulate dirt and grime. The one thing to be careful with, this just slides into place on top of the lens here, so there's nothing holding it in place. The one thing to be careful with though is right below this indicator here, there's a tiny little ball bearing, provides the clicking sound as you turn this back and forth. So that ball bearing is very easy to lose, so I'm going to just carefully slide it off with my hand over that so that the ball bearing doesn't pop out of place. There's the little ball bearing right there. We'll set that aside. Now we have the aperture control ring separate so it can be nicely cleaned, and also set that aside. The next section of the lens that we're going to remove here is this black piece that has the focusing indicator. So it's going around on the exterior here. And it's held in place by these 4 screws going around here. So I'll just undo those 4. And now lift this out of position. So at this stage, one of the important things, this is all part of the focusing mechanism that's now been exposed. So one of the important things is you can set this piece aside. So we have this body section aside. So to help with the reassembly, it's important to kind of mark where everything is lining up currently, just because this is all part of the focusing mechanism and none of this actually locks into any specific spot. So you'll want to actually, after removing that piece, mark where everything was lining up before. So what I've done here is there are 3 components here that need to be marked. So there's the interior kind of bluish black colored ring going around there, which has a little divot over here. And I've marked where that lines up with the silver ring, just with some pencil. And then I've also marked where the silver ring lines up here with the exterior black ring. So both of those need to be lined up because all three of these pieces, the black ring and the silver ring, they all turn independently. So during the reassembly, it's important that those all get lined up properly, or else focusing just will not work properly. Looking here at the focusing mechanism, there's one more piece that we can actually remove, and that is the body section here. So this body section, again, you might want to actually clean inside all these little divots, and to do that, you really don't want to clean it with the focusing mechanism still attached, because if you get any water into the focusing mechanism or any cleaning solution in there, it's not going to be good. So I'm going to actually undo these three little screws going around on the interior here. And once you undo these three screws, you have to actually go back and zero the lens again, which means making sure that it focuses properly to infinity. That's not a very complex process, but it is something to be aware of. So once you undo these screws, just remember that you have to zero the lens when putting it back together. So now I can just slide this out, and this is just the body section now, so it can be cleaned on its own. And then here is the entire focusing mechanism. So if the focusing is gritty or something, you can actually go in here, start unscrewing all these pieces and undoing those. When undoing the focusing mechanism itself, it is important that everything goes back how it was originally. So you really want to mark where everything is lining up in its current state, and then try to match that during the reassembly. I'm not going to take apart the focusing mechanism. And in most cases, if you can avoid it, you'll just want to unscrew the focusing mechanism most of the way here, instead of undoing it entirely, where you have to then go and reassemble things, because it's very easy to get the incorrect alignment. That's one of the negatives of these MC style lenses. So now we have the lens itself entirely taken apart, but let's take a look at this diaphragm. So the diaphragm here, I'm going to actually take it apart to remove the individual aperture blades here. And that's something you need to do if the diaphragm is not moving properly because there's oil on the blades or something like that, and you actually need to clean them. Cleaning the diaphragm in this current state is, you can do that okay if there's just a tiny amount of oil and things aren't moving properly, but it's hard, and you need to be very careful not to actually press too hard on the diaphragm, or else you end up damaging things. So in most cases, I would recommend actually taking apart the diaphragm and cleaning the blades individually if there's any problems with the blades or with their movement. This type of lens, this normal length Minolta lens, it's very easy to take apart the diaphragm. So actually doing that is something you can it's definitely something that you can repair fairly easily. So the way the diaphragm works here, there's a top plate with this black section here that's actually holding in place all the blades, and then a silver or kind of gold colored ring going around the exterior here that's holding in that top plate. That plate, or that ring, is held in place by three little set screws going around on the exterior of the diaphragm housing. So we'd start by actually undoing the three little set screws going around here. One other thing is that before taking apart the diaphragm, you'll want to take some sort of, take an image or something like that to actually show what the diaphragm looks like at its minimum aperture here, so at f16 in this lens. You can also make a little light mark on the diaphragm blades using a screwdriver or something like that. Just a very, very light mark to show where things were lining up before, but you will want to line things up how they were previously when putting the diaphragm back together. So I'm going to start by going around on the exterior of the lens and undoing these three little set screws. All right, so now I've removed the ring that goes on the top of the diaphragm, and now this plate is just loosely held in place there, so you can actually just dump over the entire thing on the back. So I'm actually going to hold in place this plate real quick. And on the back of the lens here, there's a little spring connecting this post down here to the interior of the diaphragm. There's a separate plate on the back. So I'm going to undo that little spring. And now the entire diaphragm assembly should just kind of slide out in one piece. Sometimes works better than other times. So I didn't quite succeed in removing it all in one piece there. Oh dear. But now I've got the blades separate, and you generally don't want to do what I just did there and tip the blades all over onto the table. So I'm just taking the blades here and putting them back onto a cleaner surface. So we have the blades here all separate from the diaphragm housing. There are the two plates here. So there's the front plate and then the back plate that we just had. And you don't want to handle the blades directly, so I'm using a tweezers to handle them because you don't want to introduce new oil onto the blades during this. So we have the housing and all the components here. So having the blades all separate like this really allows you to clean them off very well. You can go in and clean off each individual blade. You want to do that in a flat dish so that you don't bend the blades, and you do want to be careful of this little post over here, not press too hard on that for each of the blades, but you can clean them off and get all the oil off the blades. So that has the entire disassembly of the lens here complete. So we have the diaphragm here and all the components for that, separate from the optics, which I mentioned you can take further apart, but I'm not going to demonstrate that since the optics are in pretty good shape here. And then all the various body sections. So as you can see with this lens, it's a pretty simple lens in the number of components, and you really don't have to take it apart to quite the level I did here if you're just doing a simple repair. So this is showing a little bit more than you would normally have to do if you just need to make a simple repair. But it's a very repairable lens because all the components here, they're all easy enough to access. It's a similar layout to a lot of the other normal length Minolta lenses, and all the components are made of fairly high quality materials. So starting here on the reassembly of the lens with the diaphragm, looking at the components of the diaphragm, we have the front plate of the diaphragm, the back plate here, the housing, and then all the individual blades themselves. So the way that the diaphragm works, it has the back plate going into the diaphragm housing on the back of here, and then the blades sandwiched in between that back plate and the front plate. If you look at each individual blade, you'll notice that the blade has a little slot over here on one side, and then a post, a little hard to see, on the other side here. So the slot is what's going onto the pegs on the back plate here. You can see there's 6 little pegs going around there. And the post is what's going into the holes on the front plate here. And the blades are all going to go around so that they're overlapping. So I'll start by grabbing the back plate here. And starting with the back plate, I'll just take one of the blades, doesn't matter which one, and just set it so that the slot is going over the post on the back plate of the diaphragm. Then I'll take the next blade and set it so that it's on top of the first blade and also going over the post into the slot. And I'll continue doing that for the next 3 blades. This final blade is the only really tricky one. It has to go on top of the post here and then also underneath the first blade. So I'll just slide it in place kind of underneath the first blade and then get it onto the post as well over here. And now that's complete. You should see each of the blades overlapping, going around in this nice pattern like that. Now I'm going to slide the individual blades so that the interiors are all going around the circle here. This will help with aligning things in the next stage. And now I'm going to take this plate here, the top plate, and position it so that each of the little posts goes into the holes on the front plate. You have to work things back and forth a little to get it to line up properly. Okay, so now this should be all flush, and if you just kind of rotate the back plate very carefully, the blade should go in. You should see the diaphragm operating as expected there. So now I'm just going to set that like that, upside down for a moment. So now we have to get the entire diaphragm assembly here back into the housing. So looking at the back of the housing, looking at the back of the assembly here, there are 2 little posts here and here. And looking at the back of the housing, there's over here by this long post going up, there's a slot going into the interior of the lens with a little opening here and then another one over there. So the 2 posts, the one over here is going to go through the opening here, and the other one's going to go over here somewhere. And this just slides into place, but it can be a little bit difficult. And getting this back in place. So I'm just going to position it like this on my fingers there, and then slide it back up into the lens kind of in reverse. Okay, so that's got it flush in there, and I'm just going to turn it over. You want to be careful at this stage because there's nothing holding the blades in place, so they can very easily come out of position. So I'm going to drop in the silver ring, or the kind of gold colored ring here. You want the more sloped side going upwards so that the screws can go into it. I'm just going to drop that on top of the upper plate, and holding that in place, I'm then going to reinstall the set screws going around the exterior here. So I'll start with just this one over here, reinstall the 3 little set screws to lock things in place. Okay, so now I can actually turn the aperture all around safely. I'll turn the diaphragm around here, but you'll notice that if I try to go in here, it's actually not moving properly. So the diaphragm is currently not at the correct positioning. So what we need to do is actually spin around the diaphragm to get it so that at the minimum aperture here of f16, it's matching where it was originally. So if you took a photo, you need to match where the photo was showing it being. If you made little marks on the diaphragm like I did, you need to match that up. And the way you do this is by loosening up these little set screws and rotating this around. So I'm just going to hook up this little spring as well, just to make things a little bit easier. So the spring here goes over the post right on the back, right here. And then we'll actually go about getting the diaphragm into the correct position. And now I'm just going to loosen up these a little bit. Okay, so now I've got it loosened up, and I'm going to turn the front plate here around, and now I can actually move this back lever here and have it close. And now you can see that it's closing up too much there. So we don't want that. So I'm going to make sure that this is all the way over so that it's opening and closing fully. So you want the little post over here all the way over to the nearest to this fork mechanism over here. Now I'm going to spin around the plate on the inside here, this front plate, until I about match where it was originally. So I made a little mark on here. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but it's, let's see, a little more. Yeah, it's right about there. So that little mark is now lined up properly, and then I'll lock these down into that orientation by tightening the set screws again. So this is can be a little bit finicky to actually get correct, and if you then complete, or you go further along in the reassembly and you notice that the aperture is not quite opening and closing properly, maybe it's not, there's not actually movement for each step of the aperture. This is one thing that you can definitely adjust later on too, but you will have to take the lens back apart. So it can require some trial and error, and you really do want to make the marks or take a photo ahead of time when you're taking this apart so you can match that up and get the correct settings. So this looks pretty good. The other thing you want to check for besides the minimum aperture is that when it's fully open, none of the edges of the blades are visible. You want a perfect circle going around there. So that looks good. Now we've got the entire diaphragm mechanism back reassembled. So now we'll start putting together the lens around the diaphragm mechanism here. So starting off, let's just take the focusing mechanism, this piece, and let's put the diaphragm back into there. So the focusing mechanism over here, you'll notice that there's a long track right on this one side. And then on the diaphragm mechanism, there's kind of a little flat edge on the back section here, you can see. So that track and the flat edge line up, that's how you know the correct orientation. And I'll just slide these two back together. And then if everything went correctly, the holes for the 3 or the 4 screws going around top should also be lined up around there. So I'll put in the 4 screws to reinstall this. Okay, so that's got those pieces reconnected now. And the next piece we're going to reinstall is the back piece right here. So this one with the indicator on it. So this body section is going to be reinstalled. It has a little post right here, and that post is what goes into the track back here, or into the into the track on the focusing mechanism. The other thing you want to check before reinstalling this is that all the various pieces are lined up properly. So on the alignment of this one, on these 2 pieces before, we made some marks on how everything was lining up. So the mark over here on the silver section was lining up with the track section right there. So that looks good. And that just helps get the correct alignment for the focusing mechanism later. So that looks good now, and I'll reinstall this piece as well. Okay, so there's that piece reassembled now. We'll just continue on reassembling the back section of the lens. The next piece that goes in place is the aperture control ring. So the way the diaphragm is being adjusted here, the main control is this lever over on this side, so on the back section. That's coupled directly into that back plate on the diaphragm that we saw before. So that's what's moving things back and forth. So the two ways that you can adjust it is the stop-down lever on the back of the lens, which is directly controlling this lever on the diaphragm, and then by turning the aperture control ring. So what the aperture control ring does when it rotates is it moves this aperture control curve, which is on the kind of golden colored section here. So looking at the aperture control ring, there's this little fork or this little protruding section over here on the aperture control ring, and then this little fork-shaped section on the gold section over here, and those two lock together so that when you rotate the curve back and forth, or you rotate the aperture control ring back and forth, it moves this gold piece back and forth. And what moving that gold piece does is, you'll notice there's this section over here. That's the aperture control curve, and there's a little tiny post that's going along that curve. Normally that post is held up against the curve so that when you rotate it back and forth, it opens and closes the aperture. So that's how it's going to work. So to reinstall the aperture, we need to just put the fork on into the, or put the little protruding section into the fork, just like this. So like that, rotate back and forth. But we also have to get that little ball bearing in place as well. So I've got the fork installed here. This is all looking proper. So the gold section is installed there. Now I'll slide this up a little bit and put the ball bearing in place right below the indicator, the focusing indicator. There's a little pocket for it. Okay, and now using a flathead screwdriver, I'm just going to carefully press down on the ball bearing here and slide the aperture control ring over it, like that, so that you get the clicking sound as this turns back and forth, and the gold section on the inside should also be moving as you turn the aperture control ring. I see a lot of people asking about what happens if you lose the ball bearing. In that case, it's not the end of the world. It just ends up being a declicked lens so that the aperture doesn't lock into specific positions. That's sometimes actually desirable if you're shooting video. So even if you lose the ball bearing, it's not the end of the world. You can also buy little replacement ones, but they usually come in packs of like 100 or so. So you end up with way more than you need. Or you can salvage a ball bearing from another lens that is maybe broken. Now we'll reinstall the mounting plate here. So the mounting plate on the back of the lens, this is what's actually coupling the stop-down lever into the lens and also holding the aperture open by default. So if you notice right now, let me rotate this around a little. There's nothing actually holding the aperture open or closed. It's just always set to a specific position. So this mounting plate here has all of the spring mechanisms to hold it open by default. So the mounting plate, it has the stop-down lever on the back here, and then all these internal pieces, including this piece on the inside that when I move the stop-down lever moves back and forth. This one over here, and it's normally held open. So this piece has a little pocket right there that's going to go on top of the lever on the back section there. So it's going to go on top of this lever, and that's how the two couple together. So I'm just going to line those two up from the inside and then spin it around a little bit so that I have the screw holes lined up as well. And I'll reinstall the 4 screws on the back on the black section here going around. And now the only part remaining on the back of the lens here to reinstall is the back optic. It just screws in place. And I usually try to reinstall the optics last, just so that I'm not working around them and potentially damaging them with tools. So I have the back optic screwed in place, and then I'll use the spanning wrench on the 2 external divots of this black back ring to actually make sure it's fully tightened. So that's got the back of the lens now fully reassembled. I'll just put on a lens cap here to give me a more stable surface to work on. And now I'll reinstall the front optic as well. And the reason for doing things in this order is that we want to have the entire lens optically reassembled so that focusing or zeroing the lens for the next step is going to work properly. So I'm going to get the front optic, it just screws in place into the front of the lens, like that. And then I'll use a spanning wrench again on the two external divots of this black ring going around here to tighten that down. So now the lens is all optically reassembled, and we also have the mounting plate in place. That's important for the next step, which is the reinstalling the focusing ring here, so this piece. So the reason that you have to zero the lens is that when we remove this focusing ring, even if you made marks on it to indicate where it was lining up before, you can see that this focusing ring just kind of rotates all around. There's no set position where it's getting locked into. So we need to make sure that when the lens is optically focused to infinity, which is probably right around here right now, but we're not actually sure, that the lens also is indicating infinity here. So that's where you need to make sure is happening. And to do that, you really have to just mount the lens on your camera fully optically reassembled, and then find some distant object to focus to, and then adjust the focusing ring or adjust the lens optically so it's focused to infinity on that distant object, and then turn around the focusing ring so that it's also indicating infinity. So to start off that process, I'm going to reinstall the 3 little screws going around here and locking the focusing ring in place. Each of those screws has a little washer as well. So this is now all reassembled, and I'm not actually going to zero the lens, but a real quick explanation of how you would do that. So with this lens in its current state, I would go and mount it on the camera and find a distant object, like I said, focus on that so that it's optically focused at infinity, just ignoring whatever is reading over here. So let's say that this right here is optically focused to infinity right now. So the problem is that it's indicating that it's at the 3 meter mark and not infinity. So what I would then do is loosen up these 3 screws on the inside a little bit, and then spin around the focusing ring separate of the actual focusing mechanism. So they need to be loose enough so that this actually spins separately. So now that's spinning on its own. Then I would set this over here at infinity and then tighten these back down. So I'm just going to say that that is infinity now, and then I'll actually go back and zero the lens properly later. But for this video, this is going to be the infinity focus. And what you want to check is that when going between infinity here and the minimum focusing distance, it kind of clicks at both ends when it hits up against something. It shouldn't be stopping anywhere along the way in there. And then you also want to, of course, check that it's optically focused to infinity when it's actually mounted on your camera. So for the last few steps of the reassembly, the next piece is this filter ring holder. So it just goes in position with the 3 little screw holes going around on the top there. And then finally, just reinstall the name ring. It just screws in place on the front of the lens here. And I'll use the spanning wrench to make sure that that's fully in place. So that has the reassembly complete. You'll want to check and make sure that the focusing is working as expected, that it goes through the entire range, and that it's also optically focused to infinity properly, and also that the aperture control ring is doing the right thing there, and that the stop down lever is doing the correct thing. Overall, this lens, like many of the MC lenses that Minolta made, is pretty easy to repair. It's a very repairable lens, and this one in particular, because it's a normal length lens, is probably one of the easier ones to start off with. All the components are made of metal, and it's designed in such a way that you can take apart the lens and get access to everything, including inside the optics themselves, very easily. So it's a very repairable lens. And then you can make a lot of adjustments to it, make a lot of repairs fairly easily because it all is made of high quality materials. So if you have a copy that is having some problems or it just needs some minor adjustments, this is definitely a good lens that you can start off with even if you don't have that much experience taking apart and repairing lenses.